morning. It's a pleasure to be here in the Bishopsgate Institute, which is new for us. I've been asked to address you on something that's so fundamental, such a fundamental belief of myself and my party, that it's humbling, really. But it's a document, the Communist Manifesto, written by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels in 1948, which is 1848, which is the most widely circulated and well-known and the document of communism, and the first time that, if you like, the first document of scientific socialism which was circulated amongst the proletarians of Europe and the world. It's obviously written by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, and there's a picture of it here. Our party programme, indeed, the idea of this study session and the sessions that we organise, as laid down in our party programme, was that the proletariat cannot even begin to take the very first steps in the direction of its historical mission of the overthrow of capitalism and the establishment of socialism, unless it's guided by a revolutionary theory. For without a revolutionary theory, there can be no revolutionary movement. And the role of the vanguard party, which is what we aim our party to become, the party that can really equip the masses for the struggle to liberate and emancipate Britain and free the world from the influence of our pernicious ruling class. We need to educate ourselves and the proletariat. So we're filming this tonight, and we hope we'll make it available for others. The Communist Manifesto is a document as poetical as it's profound, and really it's hard even to go through the document and to take out paragraphs and to take out sentences. And really, I'm going to let the document speak for itself. And so I'm going to read bits of it quite full. I don't really make an apology for that, because you really grasp the essence of it. Hopefully we'll be able to get through it in about 45 minutes. So it begins famously by saying, a specter is haunting Europe. That specter is the specter of communism. All the powers of old Europe have entered into a holy alliance to exorcise this specter. Hope and Tsar, Metternich and Guizot, French radicals and German police spies. Where is the party in opposition that has not been decried as communistic by its opponents in power? Where the opposition that has not hurled back the branding reproach of communism against the more advanced opposition parties, as well as against its reactionary adversaries? And from this, we can say, a spectre is haunting Europe. If the spectre was haunting Europe in 1848, how much more that spectre haunts the bourgeoisie now? Comrades in my party are very fond of saying, why is it the bourgeoisie wakes up every day and says, communism is dead, communism is dead? It says it because it is the ideology of the modern proletariat. It can be no more killed than the modern proletariat. And always lurking in the background of its mind now is not just a vague spectre, a vague unease of the working class, but the real historical experience. As we're going to see, this document has a history which parallels the development of the communist movement. And Marx modified it slightly in the light of his experience of the 1871 Paris Commune. But how much more experience we've had now, seeing first the Soviet Union in 1917, and very much the spectre now we're told to, it's the spectre of Stalinism. Stalin and communism have become synonymous, and the bogeyman of Stalin is used to try and put us all off the idea of communism, the idea of socialism, and how much the spectre of Mao, that these great liberation activities, 1917 and 1949, and all of the time that passed between them, the experience of the liberation movements of humanity, how much these ideas, these liberation movements haunt the bourgeoisie, especially at a time of international financial crisis. It proves their absolute relevance. We're meeting in a hall today, Bishopsgate Institute, just down the road from where protesters are occupying. They're trying to occupy the London Stock Exchange as they're trying to occupy Wall Street, where people are waking up and seeing that financial capitalism is robbing people's future. It's creating a world that is so divorced from our interests that they cannot help but feel an instinctual revulsion and hatred of that capitalism. And yet, for all that, 163 years after this document was published, so many of them have still an instinctual grasp. They do not have even the elements of scientific socialism to really understand the phenomenon with which they're grappling. And I hope that by propagating this work, we can help to address that. So here is the original Manifesto of the Communist Party, published in 1848. And in fact, it was published in London and indeed in Bishopsgate, 46 Liverpool Street. So literally round the corner from where we're meeting. And famously putting forward the slogan, Proletariat aller Lande vereint auch, workers of all countries unite. So printed in 1848, but it was commissioned by the Congress of the Communist League, which was the first, at first initially all German and then international organization of communist workers. And it was to be published in English, French, German, Italian, Flemish, Dutch, and disseminated widely amongst the proletarians of Europe. And in fact, it was printed just before the uprisings of February in France, and in fact was circulating in Paris and in France at the time of the great 1848 uprising, which was one of the first clashes, great clashes between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie on the European continent and indeed on the world stage, which heralded later on the 1871 and of course 1917 and our subsequent epoch, which is really the epoch of great class struggles between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, as we'll see. That organisation was in fact subsequently suppressed when in Germany and in the Cologne Communist trial. Most of the central committee of it were arrested, and of course Marx and Engel lived much of their lives in exile, principally in London, Manchester, in England, as well as other places. And it was replaced then by the International Working Men's Association of 1864 to 74, which Marx himself didn't avowedly adopt the Communist Manifesto, precisely because it had to be a consensus document that led that group. And at that time, it was English trade unionists, French, Belgian, Italian, Spanish, anarchists, Proudhonists, Lassallean reformist socialists in Germany, all had to agree the programme. But nevertheless, it had a profound impact, and certainly by the time of its dissolution, this was a guiding spirit of the socialist movement and generally accepted. Engels laid down the aim expressly that the Communist Manifesto had as its object the proclamation of the inevitability of the impending dissolution of modern bourgeois property. And furthermore, that the emancipation of the workers must be the act of the working class itself. For the international dissemination, for its popularization of the idea, Marx said he relied on the intellectual development of the workers themselves, that the very events and vicissitudes of the struggle against capital, the defeats even more than the victories, could not help bringing home to men's minds the insufficiency of their various favourite nostrums and preparing the way for a more complete insight into the conditions of working class emancipation, to get rid of faddishness, to get rid of sporadic ideas, to get rid of just a vague grasping, but actually to lead through their experience of struggle to more comprehensive ideas about what was necessary for their liberation. And the central idea of the Communist Manifesto, as the central idea of Marxism, was expounded, that economic production was the motive force of history, and that it was economic production and the structure of society of every historical epoch that arose from that economic production that constitute the foundation for the political and intellectual history of that epoch. Now, this is a very revolutionary idea. Engels, was famously quoted as saying, well, in fact, he said in the introduction, that he expected this idea, this central platform of Marxism, of materialism, as applied to history, to do for history what Darwinian ideas on the origin of species had done for biology and for natural science. So consequently, ever since the dissolution of the primeval communal ownership of land, all history, so the written history, the history of civilization, has been a history of class struggles, of struggles between the exploited and the exploiting, between the dominated and the dominating classes at various stages of social development. This struggle, however, has now reached a stage where the exploited and oppressed class, the proletariat literally meaning the class who have no property, whose only way of living is by selling their own labour power. So the proletariat, the workers, can no longer emancipate themselves, free themselves from the class which exploits and oppresses them, the bourgeoisie, the capitalists, without at the same time forever freeing the whole of society from exploitation, oppression, and class struggle itself. And therefore, it's a fundamentally different revolution which awaits us. So Marx, the essence of the book then goes on to describe how this state came to being, to describe the bourgeois and proletarian classes, and to trace its development of capitalism through history, and from that material basis then to look at the future direction of the movement and what lessons we can draw. So freeman and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, guildmaster and journeyman, in a word, oppressor and oppressed, stood in constant opposition to one another. They carried on an uninterrupted, now hidden, now open fight, that each time ended either in a revolutionary reconstitution of society at large or in the common ruin of the contending classes. So capitalism is a class society. We're very used to Maggie Thatcher telling us that it's not a society at all. There are only individuals and their families. It's precisely, we're being drummed with these ideas to get us away from the idea of this class antagonism in society. But it's a central thread of Marxism to recognise that these contending forces between these two classes are what drive history forward. So the modern bourgeois society has sprouted from the ruins of feudal society, has not done away with class antagonisms. It has but established new classes, new conditions of oppression, new forms of struggle in the place of the old ones. The epoch of the bourgeoisie possesses, however, this distinctive feature. It has simplified class antagonisms. Society as a whole is more and more splitting up into two great hostile camps, two great classes, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, directly facing each other. Marx points out that the impetus for the development of the bourgeoisie was given by the development of the world market. He said the discovery of America, the rounding of the Cape, opening up of fresh ground for the rising bourgeoisie, the rising capitalist class, the East Indian and Chinese markets, and ultimately conquest and colony, the opium trade, trade with the colonies, and of course the slave trade, which he hasn't mentioned explicitly in this passage, but which he describes so vividly in many of his writings, particularly in Capital, as is described in an excellent work, Slavery and Sugar, which is well worth reading, about how capital was accumulated, how this gave an enormous, so the exchange in commodities generally gave to commerce, to navigation, to industry, an impulse never before known in the history of mankind. And therefore, despite the disgusting nature of these phenomena when viewed from a moral perspective, it gave a tremendously revolutionary element to the tottering feudal society and a rapid development. The feudal system of industry, under which industrial production was monopolized by closed guilds, couldn't produce the volume of goods necessary to supply these new markets, and the manufacturing system took its place. And as the markets kept growing, even the manufacturing system no longer sufficed, and thereupon steam and machinery revolutionized industrial production. And really, where it mentions steam, you can really think of mechanized modern industry as it developed. Steam in the first instance was its first manifestation, and the one which would have been current in Marx's day. So in proportion as industry, as commerce, as navigation, as railways extended, in the same proportion the bourgeoisie developed, increased its capital, and pushed into the background every class handed down from the Middle Ages. We see therefore how the bourgeoisie is itself the product of a long course of development, of a series of revolutions in the modes of production and exchange. It grew in the womb of the feudal society. It became a powerful class to the point where it came into contention with those forces, as we'll see. And so we can talk, if you like, about a progressive nature to capitalism at this stage, in contradistinction to feudalism. And we're really talking historically that the bourgeoisie has played this progressive part. The bourgeoisie, wherever it has got the upper hand, has put an end to all feudal, patriarchal, idyllic relations. It has pitilessly torn asunder the motley feudal ties that bound man to his natural superiors, and left remaining no other nexus between man and man than naked self-interest, than callous cash payment. You see how rich is his description of the phenomenon. At the same time, we're disgusted by it, that the relationship between man and man should just be money. It is disgusting. We all seek for more depth in our human relationships. We think of our life as so much more. And yet he's contrasting that to the feudal relations, where everything seemed spiritual and very meaningful, and yet it kept men in benighted ignorance, in perpetual slavery, in servitude, not understanding the world, never questioning his place in society, in subjection in that manner. And so capitalism has epitomized, has brought to its highest level, I don't know whether to call it a zenith or it's nadir, but has brought out exploitation as the main feature of class society. It has drowned, to use Marx's beautifully poetic and descriptive language, the most heavenly ecstasies of religious fervour, of chivalrous enthusiasm, of Philistine sentimentalism in the icy water of egotistical calculation. It's resolved personal worth into exchange value, and in place of the numberless, indefeasible chartered freedoms, which were the feature of feudal society, you would give a tithe, you give 10% of your wealth to the church, you give a certain percentage of your land to the landlord, you had duties to perform, to serve in his armies, etc., 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 and it went on and on and on. And it was fixed, immutable, seemingly, unchanging for all time. So in place of that, it set up this single unconscionable freedom of free trade. In one word, for exploitation veiled by religious and political illusions, it has substituted naked, shameless, direct and brutal exploitation. And we've all become wage labourers. I myself am a doctor, and this sentence has always jumped out at me, and it's very true. People are not happy with the idea of being wage labourers. Everyone has sold the idea that they're somehow more, that they're a member of the ruling class, that ideologically we're attached to the ruling class. But if you actually look at the economic relations of society, the vast majority of people have been reduced to the status of paid wage labourers. And Marx says the bourgeoisie has stripped of its halo every occupation hitherto honoured and looked up to with reverend awe. It's converted the physician, the lawyer, the priest, the poet, the man of science into its paid wage labourers. The priests, these great moral guardians of society, how often is it that they breast our armed forces as they go off to war to do the bidding of the imperialists? Of course, the man of science himself has his entire work and intellectual output channeled towards the needs of business. And yet for all this, capitalism has shown us a boundless productivity of labour. The bourgeoisie has disclosed how it came to pass that the brutal display of vigour in the Middle Ages, running around knights, fighting each other, conquesting lands, crusades, it all seemed like a lot was happening. The brutal display of vigour in the Middle Ages, which reactionists so much admire, found its fitting complement in the most slothful indolence, actually, that labour was so unproductive. That actually there was, a genuinely low level of production which hampered the development of mankind. It has been the first to show what man's activity can bring about. The bourgeoisie, during its rule of scarcely 100 years, has created more massive and more colossal productive forces than have all preceding generations together. Subjection of nature's forces to man, machinery, the application of chemistry to industry and agriculture, steam navigation, powered navigation, railways, electric telegraphs, clearing of whole continents for cultivation, canalization of rivers, whole populations conjured from the ground, the great population explosion, and therefore, of course, a great realization, a great increase in the potential productivity, intellectual and physical output of mankind. What earlier century had even a presentiment that such productive forces slumbered in the lap of social labour? So it's brought, actually, capitalism, for all its extolling of individualism, has shown us the virtues and benefits of cooperation, of really scientific application of socialised labour. And this has been its great gift to us and its legacy for humanity, if you like. More than that, it causes constant change in the production and social relations. Lenin used to often talk about the means of production being the most revolutionary element of social relations. So the bourgeoisie cannot exist without constantly revolutionising the instruments of production, and thereby the relations of production, and with them the whole relations of society. Conservation of the old modes of production in unaltered form was, on the contrary, the precondition of the existence of all previous industrial classes. Constant revolutionizing of production, uninterrupted disturbance of all social conditions, everlasting uncertainty and agitation distinguish the bourgeois epoch from all earlier ones. And this, of course, this shaking up of human relations, this realizing that things aren't forever fixed and unchanging, also brings an element of self-consciousness in the development of the brain and the development of matter that thinks. There's always a question of at what point does self-awareness dawn? And there's a similar process in history. At what point does man become self-aware of the processes that drive history? And capitalism has been a most revolutionary element in that. So all fixed, fast, frozen relations with their train of ancient and venerable prejudices and opinions are swept away. All new formed ones become antiquated before they can ossify, become solid, turn into bone, literally. All that is solid, and this is, again, beautifully poetic phrase which can't help to move and inspire as well as inform. All that is solid melts into air. All that is holy is profaned. And man is at last compelled to face, with sober senses, his real conditions of life and his relations with his kind. The need of a constantly expanding market, and capitalism extends over the whole planet. Capitalism, in the battle for competition, has to constantly extend his production or he dies, So one capitalist kills many, and the same force that leads him, to expand his production makes him need to find new markets, new avenues of investment, new raw materials, new places to exploit. So the need of a constantly expanding market for its products chases the bourgeoisie over the whole surface of the globe. It must nestle everywhere, settle everywhere, establish connections everywhere. And again, interestingly, I remember saying my wedding speech, I'm married to a Chinese woman, my father's Indian, my mother's English. Imperialism has brought all peoples of the world into close cooperation with each other. And again, to the chagrin of many reactionarists who, despite being, actually some of them from the capitalist class or benefiting from the capitalist class or thinking they extol the ideas of capitalism, have yet failed to embrace one of the positive aspects of capitalism and imperialism, which is that it really does bring into existence a world culture, a world economy, a world literature. It brings into close contact and eliminates the kind of petty parochialism, if you like, of people. So to the great chagrin of reactionists, capitalism has drawn from under the feet of industry the national ground on which it stood. In place of the old local and national seclusion and self-sufficiency, we have intercourse in every direction, a universal interdependence of nations. Now, there's interdependence, of course, and interdependence. And we're not talking so much here about Lenin's theory of imperialism, which we'll see later in our series of lectures that we hope to bring to you. And of course, that universal interdependence is by no means an equal relationship. There are exploiting nations and exploited nations, and that is very clear, an ongoing major source of inequality, but also a major source of struggle and political action in the world. However, capitalism brings into close relations the whole of mankind. And as in material, so in intellectual production, the intellectual creations of individual nations become common property. Who is not aware of Shakespeare? Even now English people are aware of Ghalib and the great poetry of Ghalib and this figure in India. Who doesn't know about the great philosophers of China, whether it's Confucianism or indeed of Mao, of proletarian or feudal. So the experience of world history and world culture increasingly is the property of each of us, and we can really start to talk about ourselves as citizens of the world and not just a local national identity. National one-sidedness and narrow-mindedness become more and more impossible. And the bourgeoisie creates a world in its own image by the rapid improvement of all instruments of production, by the immensely facilitated means of communication. It draws all, even the most barbarian nations, into civilization. And that's not a phrase I've included, but he talks about the cheap price of English industrial goods being, the means it uses to batter down all Chinese walls through competition, through actually providing cheap goods through improved means of production. It becomes an irresistible force, disturbing the economy, if you look of other nations, but also bringing them out of their feudal torpor and into the model world, forcing them to become also bourgeois, capitalists, to develop themselves. It compels all nations on pain of extinction to adopt the bourgeois mode of production. it compels them to introduce what it calls civilization into their midst, i.e. to become bourgeois themselves. In a word, it creates a world after its own image. The bourgeoisie keeps on more and more doing away with the scattered state of the population, of the means of production and of property. It agglomerates population, centralizes means of production, and concentrates property in fewer and fewer hands. The necessary consequence of this was political centralization, and bringing together independent nationalities into the actual formation of nations. Now, of course, once they'd done that, no sooner they had brought the nations into being, the nations themselves were too small, and it had to burst, the boundary of the nations and seek for the world market we already talked about. And still, we say in our critique of, the bourgeoisie, in order to divide workers, says it tries to set up native, indigenous workers against immigrant workers that it draws from all corners of the globe. But there's no barriers to capital. Capital, as we've said, searches everywhere, nestles everywhere, is free to cross all boundaries, to exploit all labour. And so we must learn also to demand the right of working people to cross all boundaries and not be subject to these divisions. We see then that the means of production and of exchange on whose foundation the bourgeoisie has built itself up were generated within feudal society. And at a certain stage in the development of these means of production and exchange, the feudal relations of property became no longer compatible with the already developed productive forces. They became so many fetters. So the bourgeoisie grew up from the humble burgher of the third estate of the feudal society, became so economically powerful through the extension of the market, through extension into colonies, through the extension into manufacture, that it now sought political power to reorganize society around its interests. So the old fetters had to be burst asunder. They were burst asunder. Into their place stepped free competition, accompanied by a social and political constitution adapted to it, and by the economical and political sway of the bourgeois class. And this was the content of the English Cromwellian civil war and revolution. This was the content of 1789 and the French Revolution, and it was the content of 1848 and many of the revolutions that happened in the continent of Europe and elsewhere. But then we see now a similar movement of matter, movement of society, is going on before our own eyes. Modern bourgeois society, with its relations of production, of exchange, and of property, a society that we've seen has conjured up such gigantic means of production and of exchange, is, to use a powerful metaphor, like the sorcerer who's no longer able to control the powers of the netherworld, whom he's called up by his spells. So for many a decade past, the history of industry and commerce is but the history of revolt of modern productive forces against the conditions of production. What does this mean? Against the property relations that are the conditions for the existence of the bourgeoisie and of its rule. It's enough to mention, and this is Marx writing and Engel's writing in 1847, published in 1848, it's enough to mention the commercial crises that by their periodical return put on its trial each time more threateningly the existence of the entire bourgeois society. Harpal spoke not long ago, it was 2008 now, but he was called at the time of the massive meltdown of the great banks to speak in Oxford Union, and the topic of the talk was capitalism can save the planet, or can capitalism save the planet? And I still remember very well, he said, at a time when the stock market is plunging, when the housing market is slumping, when financial giants are failing, and these big banks are collapsing and having to be going cap in hand and being bailed out by the government, haven't the capitalists got a nerve to say that capitalism can save the planet and socialism has nothing to offer? Quite clearly, the bourgeoisie are able to get through these periods of crises if they're unchallenged by united political action and will of the bourgeoisie. But if we also look to see how they've got through these crises, and we'll come to it, they do it by subjecting humanity to tremendous periods of pain. In these crises, there breaks out an epidemic that in all earlier epochs would have seemed an absurdity, the epidemic of overproduction. Society suddenly finds itself put back into a state of momentary barbarism. It appears as if a famine, a universal war of devastation, had cut off the supply of every means of subsistence. Industry and commerce seem to be destroyed. And why? Because there's too much civilization, too much means of subsistence, too much industry, too much commerce. Marx, again in Capital, says, precisely in that battle of competition to produce cheaper and cheaper goods, in the battle of capital, he says, in the battle of competition, the general who wins is he who discharges most of his army. If you are able to mechanize your process of production, if you're able to actually use less variable capital, if you're able to use less working time, if you're able to employ less people in your concern, you can produce each item and more items cheaper and cheaper. But ultimately, by discharging people, by creating more and more unemployed, you're diminishing the actual size of the market. So you come to a point where markets are glutted, despite the fact you're able to, in greater measure than ever before, satisfy the needs and wants of humanity by impoverishing them, by the fact that actually this social product is accumulated in the hands of the individual capitalist rather than in the hands of society. There's a ghost that's put in between the levers of production and the ability of the people to consume the goods that they themselves have produced. And this is the origin of this crisis. So the productive forces at the disposal of society no longer tend to further the development of the conditions of bourgeois property. The conditions of bourgeois society are too narrow to comprise the wealth created by them. And the consequences that we've seen are destruction. So destruction of the means of production, destruction of the products, unemployment, and the bourgeoisie attempt to further subjugate colonies, further create new markets, and of course destroy both fixed and variable capital, so human beings, the proletariat themselves, as well as the means of production and means of consumption through war, the most destructive means. And the working class, the people of the world have paid fully over the last century. If you just look at the 2 world wars alone, 100 million people have been sacrificed, the lives of 100 million people have been sacrificed on the high altar of capital to keep this show on the road. And this is not counting their everyday economic impoverishment and famine and death that it engenders. This is the straightforward conflict necessary to keep capitalism going, precisely because it's racked by crises and it's well past its sell-by date. And so Marx, in this document, forecast the death of capitalism prophetically. He said the weapons with which the bourgeoisie felled feudalism to the ground are now turned against the bourgeoisie itself. Not only has the bourgeoisie forged the weapons that bring death to itself, it has also called into existence the men who are to wield those weapons, the modern working class, the proletarians. Masses of labour, as he pointed out, crowded into the factory, are organised like soldiers. Not only are they slaves of the bourgeois class and of the bourgeois state, they are daily and hourly enslaved by the machine, by the overlooker, and above all, by the individual bourgeois manufacturer himself. And the more openly this despotism proclaims gain to be its end and aim, the more petty, the more hateful, and the more embittering it is. So workers are called into existence, concentrated in conditions of production and life which are profoundly unsatisfying. And it's brought to their attention that all of this is done not to further the interests of them and the majority of humanity, but of the capitalist class. So of all the classes that stand face to face with the bourgeoisie, the proletariat alone is the really revolutionary class. Whilst other classes decay and finally disappear in the face of modern industry, the proletariat is its special and essential product. The capitalist cannot maintain himself as a capitalist without maintaining and propagating the working class. The lowest strata of the middle class, the small tradespeople, shopkeepers and retired tradesmen generally, the handicraftsmen and peasants, all these sink gradually into the proletariat. Thus the proletariat is recruited from all classes of the population, and while it goes through various stages of development, from its birth begins its struggle with the bourgeoisie. And while this is carried out first on an individual basis, by individual labourers, then by work people of a factory, by operatives in a trade and a locality against an individual bourgeois who directly exploits them. With the development of industry, the proletariat increases in number, it becomes concentrated in greater masses, and its strength grows, and it feels that strength increasingly. So the collisions between individual workers and individual bourgeoisie take more and more the character of collisions between two classes. Thereupon the workers begin to form combinations, trade unions against the bourgeoisie. They club together in order to protect their wages. They found permanent associations in order to make provision beforehand for these occasional revolts, and here and there these struggles break out into riots. And whilst the workers are now and then victorious, the main fruit, Marx was anxious to point out, of these battles were not the temporary concessions, but actually the ever-expanding union of working people themselves. It's sad to, in a way, to look at the history of our country, and we must always bear in mind that in addition to the classical understanding of Marxism, we have to add on our understanding of imperialism itself. That by generating super profits abroad, capitalism has for periods, especially in the heartlands of imperialism, here in Britain, in the United States and Europe and elsewhere, raised our level of subsistence, bribed us, removed us from that direct struggle where we are forced to be revolutionary in our outlook and combination. And so we are faced with, on the one hand, social democracy, and on the other hand, a trade union movement, which very often portrays the other side of this nature, which is a conciliatory nature and doesn't portray those direct struggles. But nevertheless, the trade unions were a fundamental advance in the ability of workers to protect their interest and wage struggle with the bourgeoisie. And Marx pointed out that the bourgeoisie, in their increasing unionization, compels a legislative recognition of particular interests of the workers by taking advantage of a division amongst the bourgeoisie itself. And he pointed at that stage to the 10-hour bill, which was to limit working hours. But you could talk about legal recognition of unions and an endless series of health and safety laws, and many concessions that we have won. Universal education to an extent. As ever, these things are the result of a balance of class forces and are subject to change. And as we've seen now, living in a period of crisis, all of these things, as long as capitalism remains, can gradually be taken back from us. Nevertheless, what concessions we've won have been to a large extent as a result of previous revolutionary action on the part of the proletariat.
Sure.
So the bourgeoisie finds itself involved in a constant battle, first with the aristocracy, later on with those portions of the bourgeoisie itself whose interests have become antagonistic to the progress of industry, and at all times with the bourgeoisie of foreign countries. And in all its battles, the bourgeoisie doesn't do its own fighting. It has to recruit the proletariat to do its fighting for it, and thus to drag the working class into the political arena. And it's the bourgeoisie itself, therefore, in the last analysis, that supplies the proletariat with its own elements of political and general education. In other words, it furnishes the proletariat with the weapons for fighting the bourgeoisie. And we know in times of struggle that literally means the weapons, but also with the education, the means for understanding and applying itself to the political task of overthrowing the bourgeoisie. When people don't know much about socialism, they say they think that a phrase they've often heard is that property is theft, and actually the sentence itself comes from Proudhon, property is theft, but there's a fundamental idea behind it which is correct, and that is that all preceding classes sought to fortify their already acquired status by subjecting society at large to their conditions of appropriation. The proletarians, however, have nothing of their own to secure and fortify. Their mission is to destroy all previous securities for an insurance of individual property. We're talking about that property. Property is property in the means of production. So it's not your individual toothbrush, it's not your individual place where you live, it's not your sleeping bag, it's not your ability to produce your standard of life. They're talking about the fruit of labour, which allows you then to go on and exploit other people's labour. The modern labourer, instead of rising with the progress of industry, becomes a pauper, and pauperism develops more rapidly than population and wealth. And certainly, again, if you think now not just of the industrialized Western world, the imperialist world. If you look overall at the world, we live in a world of unparalleled mechanization and industry, unparalleled productivity of labor, and yet, 4/5, if not 9/10 of the world's population live a wretched and miserable existence where they don't have their basic needs met. And here it becomes evident that the bourgeoisie is unfit any longer to be the ruling class in society and to impose its own conditions of existence upon society as an overriding law. It's unfit to rule, Marx points out, because it's incompetent even to assure an existence to its slave within his slavery. Marx is quite clear that he regards the wages system as wage slavery. We're encouraged to think of it as a free contract. We have the right to sell our labour or not. Everything is very, this is a relationship of equals. But while we're alienated from the means of production, we really have no choice. We have the choice between unemployment and starvation or a miserable existence, and selling ourselves to be exploited. However, because it cannot help letting us sink into such a state that it has to feed the working class instead of being fed by him, society can no longer live under the bourgeoisie. In other words, its existence is no longer compatible with society at large. So the essential condition for existence and for the sway of the bourgeois class is the formation and augmentation of capital. The condition for capital is wage labour. Capital means it's not just money, it's a social relation, it's a definite quantity of money that allows me to employ someone else. Employing someone else, they produce value through their work. And I give to the wage labourer not the value that he's produced by his work, but just enough for him to live. And the difference I pocket. And this is capitalism. This allows me to actually harvest the work, not just of an individual, but of a whole society. So the social product of society comes to me, and this is capital. So the condition for the existence and for the sway of the bourgeois class is the formation and augmentation of capital. I must increase my profit or I'll go under. The condition for capital is wage labour. There must be labourers who have nothing to live on apart from their ability to sell themselves to me. And wage labour rests exclusively on competition between the labourers. So the labourer has to be a free market for me to command a sufficiently low price for the labour to generate healthy profits. But the advance in industry, whose involuntary promoter of the bourgeoisie, replaces the isolation of the labourers due to competition with their revolutionary combination due to their association. And Marx says this element of centralising the workers, of allowing them to see their exploitation, to work together, to command a higher price for their labour, and ultimately to realise that it's in their interest to overthrow the system, is the key to the abolition of capitalism. So the development of modern industry therefore cuts from under its feet the very foundation on which the bourgeoisie produces and appropriates its products. What the bourgeoisie therefore produces above all are its own grave diggers. Its fall and the victory of the proletariat are equally inevitable. So this, so far, has been a fairly rapid, but fairly comprehensive and sweeping view of the whole of the development of civilization through class society up to the point where the modern proletariat and the modern bourgeoisie face each other. And it puts communism, the desire of working people for a better life, on a rational, scientific basis, that they've understood the motive force for history, they've understood what's compelling the capitalist society to disintegrate, they've understood the revolutionary element, they've understood how they can then alter society in order to change it. The question of seizing power and overthrowing the capitalist order of society has been firmly put on the agenda. And Marx goes on to deal with then what is the program of communists and the relationship between communists with the working class in general. And he says the communists do not form a separate party opposed to other working class parties. They have no interests separate and apart from those of the proletariat as a whole. They do not set up sectarian principles of their own by which to shape and mould the proletarian movement. Rather, they seek to become the general staff of the proletariat. The communists are distinguished only from other working class parties by two features, he says, two fundamental features. In the national struggles of the proletarians of the different countries, they point out and bring to the front the common interests of the entire proletariat independently of all nationality. And two, in the various stages of development which the struggle of the working class against the bourgeoisie has to pass through, they always and everywhere represent the interests of the movement as a whole. So, just as the government properly functioning of a bourgeois society doesn't act for the whole of society, it acts as an executive for the direction of the fundamental overall interests of the capitalists within that nation. The goal of the working class has to be to establish a unified command, to look to the long-term interests of working people and to be able to direct the short-term struggles successfully with a view to the final emancipation of working class. So the immediate aim of the Communist Party is the same as that of all the other proletarian parties. Now, when you wrote this may well have been the case. I wish there were many other proletarian parties which aimed for the formation of the proletariat into a class, for the overthrow of bourgeois supremacy and the conquest of political power by the proletariat. But if you look around and you see parties who claim to represent working people, other than the Communist Party, and this really, I do mean the CPGB-ML, small as we are and far removed as we are from having the deep roots amongst the masses that enable us to fill this aim, no one in Britain sets themselves this task. If you actually look at the existing political parties that call themselves socialist, communists, Trotskyists, revisionists, they're tied hand and foot to Labour Party, social democracy, and really never put the issue of working class power on the agenda. So our theoretical understanding says is materialist, not utopian or idealist, and therefore what we're expressing is, in general terms, actual relations springing from an existing class struggle, from a historical movement going on under our very eyes. And the distinguishing feature of communism is not the abolition of property, because every revolution, every class that comes to power has abolished a previous form of property corresponding to the old class society. Capitalism got rid of feudal property, got rid of the property in the peasantry, got rid of serfdom, got rid of the property and exclusivity of possession of the land. Okay, but the role of communists is to abolish bourgeois property and put in place proletarian forms of ownership. And it's in this sense that property is theft. The distinguishing feature of communism is not the abolition of property generally, but the abolition of bourgeois property. In this, the abolition of private property. And then Marx goes on at great length precisely with the fact that the modern critique of capitalism, and it still is very much true today, is precisely aimed at this point. How can you possibly get rid of private property as the fruit of a man's own labour, the just fruit of a man's own labour, which property is alleged to be? So it's meant to be the groundwork of all personal freedom, activity and independence, and this is still very much an idea which is current and held up. If you listen to the Today programme or watch the news or just go to school, individual property is meant to be the right to your labour. You work hard and it's your individual property, and it's very much the idea which is put hard-won, self-acquired, self-earned property. But does wage labour create any property for the labourer? And Marx answers this not a bit. It creates capital. So my working in the factory creates wealth not for myself, other than the ability simply to reproduce my standard of living, and in fact to eke out an ever more miserable existence. But it creates vast amounts of wealth for the person who owns the factory. So in fact, it creates capital, i.e. that kind of property which exploits wage labour and which cannot increase except upon condition of finding new workers to exploit. So capital, therefore, this wealth which is able to exploit workers, is in fact not an individual product, it's a collective product, it's a product of collective humanity. And only by the united action of many members, in the last resort, by the united action of all members of society, can it be set in motion. Capital is therefore not a personal, but a social power. It belongs by right not to an individual, but to the mass of people who produce it. When, therefore, so the act of revolution transfers capital from individual into common property, into the property of all members of society, personal property is not therefore transformed into social property. So what it's saying is this capital was made by the whole of society. It's appropriated by the bourgeoisie. The act of giving that social product back to the people is not the act of abolition of property, it's merely the abolition of the social relation and the power of the capitalist class to carry on exploiting us indefinitely. So the average price of wage labour, he points out, is the minimum wage. Capitalism constantly forces down the wage that we receive to the quantum of the means of subsistence, which is absolutely requisite to keep the labourer in a bare existence. So communism by no means intends to abolish this personal appropriation of the products of labour, an appropriation that is made for the maintenance and reproduction of human life, and that leaves no surplus to command the labour of others. So the wage labour gets out of capitalism enough to live. We're not trying to do away with distributing social product amongst the people. On the contrary, we want to do away with the miserable character of this appropriation, under which the labourer lives merely to increase capital, to generate profits for the bourgeoisie, for the capitalists, for the wealthy, and are only allowed to live, to have jobs, to have an existence, insofar as the interest of the ruling class requires it. In bourgeois society, Marx and Engel point out, living labour, so the working man, is only a means to increase accumulated labour, to make wealth and profit for the capitalist class. In a communist society, accumulated labour, so the past wealth, on the contrary, is but a means to widen, to enrich, to promote the existence of the labourer. So in a very real sense, you can talk about capitalism as living in the past, but socialist and communist society looks to the future and actually puts working people in the driving seat and in command of the product that they produce. It says the capitalists are horrified at our intent to do away with private property. But in your existing society, in the society we live in today, private property is already done away with for 9/10 of the population. Its existence for the few is solely due to its non-existence in the hands of those 9/10. And if you really look at just some key social indices and statistics of wealth distribution today, you don't just have to look at the rich list. If you actually see that 250 billionaires still have this controlling stake in the entire world economy, whilst at the other end of the spectrum you have 2 billion people who live on less than $2 a day, another billion who live on less than $1 a day. Half the world's population are living this hand-to-mouth existence. Quarter of the 25% of the world's population live in food insecurity. 1 billion people don't have their housing needs met adequately. Even in the richest country in the world, the United States of America, 40 million people don't have access to healthcare. And looking at Ella's lovely presentation, which is available on YouTube, on the food crisis, you can see that actually 10% of the American population, the richest, purest nation on earth, are food insecure, are hungry, do not eat, are hungry on a daily basis. And this is the distribution that is promoted by capitalist property. And so what we're talking about is not doing away with property for the masses, but on the contrary, taking the wealth stolen from the masses and giving it back to them. You approach us, therefore, with intending to do away with a form of property, the necessary conduction for whose existence is the non-existence of any property for the immense majority of society. In a word, you approach us with intending to do away with your property. Precisely so. That is just what we intend. Communism deprives no man of the power to appropriate the products of society. All that it does is to bribe him of the power to subjugate the labour of others by means of such appropriation. It's been objected to, and it's still overwhelming. If you look now, 850 billion has been given to bankers, and we're distracted from the very phenomenon. What does it mean, 850 is given to bankers? It means that the state, that's control of our taxes, responds to every need and every whim and every desire of the capitalist class. At the same time, the £35 a week education maintenance allowance, which was keeping masses of youth in education and giving them some hope of an enlightened future. Actually, no more hope of getting a job given the economic crisis, but nevertheless had a real impact on the masses of people's lives and was much cheaper, has been abolished. So we're facing tremendous cuts, whilst the capitalists are appropriating all of the wealth of the nation to try and bail out their failing institutions. But nevertheless, they are giving themselves enormous bonuses. And they give themselves enormous bonuses on the basis that they create wealth, number one, which we know is a lie, because actually it's labour, human labour power that creates wealth. But also on the basis that it's an incentive. They need that incentive in order to keep them in those high-powered jobs and keep the economy ticking over. And without it, they will leave to other big banks, and therefore it's the only way the system can work. And yet, they say that upon the abolition of private property, all work will cease and universal laziness will overtake us. So there we have a society in which the vast majority have virtually nothing overall in the world. Even in this country, which is relatively wealthy, working people are being forced to suffer privations but encouraged to work harder and harder and harder, tighten your belts, work harder, dig yourselves out of this crisis. On the other hand, the bourgeoisie are giving themselves huge bonuses. But we're saying universal laziness will overtake us if we get rid of this private property, this distribution of wealth. Surely, according to this, Marx points out, bourgeois society ought long ago to have gone to the dogs through sheer idleness. For those of its members who work acquire nothing, and those who acquire anything do no work. And you only have to sit down and think for a second about the facts which present themselves to you every day to realise how true that is. What a farce it is to say that the system of inequality is the only incentive for production. Yes, the bourgeoisie brought forward tremendous, in its revolutionary stage, tremendous productivity of labour, but it's precisely that revolutionary element, the means of production which have outgrown the fetters of the relations of production which are now forced upon them, precisely the crisis, precisely the sun, precisely the inability of capitalism to meet and fulfill the demands of working people, for us all to fulfill our potential and build constructive lives, productive lives. That means it's well past its sell-by date and was long overdue for abolition. In the last analysis, Marx points out that this is just a repetition of, in fact, a tautology, that where there's no wage labour, there can be no capital. That this whole argument reduces itself to that capitalism cannot think beyond its own conditions of existence and cannot imagine a productive world where it doesn't occupy the position of the ruling class, the master of production, the master of humanity's destiny. In fact, there's not one, but there are two national cultures. There's a proletarian and a bourgeois culture which compete with each other within every nation. Just as to the bourgeois, the disappearance of class property is the disappearance of production itself, so the disappearance of class culture is to him identical with the disappearance of all culture. And if you compare this with the Deep South and Mississippi, the kind of glowing terms in which the slaveholders would speak about slavery as an institution, how it was good for their Negroes, how the Negroes benefited from it, how it was enlightening them, how they were happy, how they loved living in these conditions. The ability to reconcile your thought with your material conditions, to not be able to see beyond it, to not even present yourself with questions that these might be human beings like you, who might have desires similar to you, who might not like to live in these conditions. And this is all just a reflection of this phenomenon. So that culture, the loss of which the bourgeoisie laments, is for the enormous majority in the world today a mere training to act as a machine or a preparation for so many to sit on the scrap heap of unemployment, to have no future, to have no productivity, to have no creativity, to have no life. But this self-interest of the tiny elite is portrayed as national and universal, and it's the constant trick, it's the constant theme recurring throughout our media, throughout our educational system. Marx and Engel say to the bourgeoisie, your very ideas are but the outgrowth of the conditions of your bourgeois production and bourgeois property, just as your jurisprudence is but the will of your class made into a law for all. How true that is whenever we see any great judgment, any great inquiry, whether it's the Widgery inquiry, whether it's inquiry into death of Ian Tomlinson, whether any inquiry set up, these inquiries are set up to perpetuate the class system, perpetuate injustice. They're not really designed to get to the bottom, and absolute the bottom of injustice, and absolutely at the central pillar of our legal system is the preservation of bourgeois property, and therefore the exploitation of the vast majority. Just as your jurisprudence is but the will of your class made into a law for all, a will whose essential character and direction are determined by the economic conditions of existence of your class. Marx points out that communists are further approached with desiring to abolish countries and nationality. But he points out the working men in fact have no country, and we cannot take from them what they do not have. Since the proletariat must first of all acquire political supremacy, must rise to be the leading class of the nation and constitute itself a nation, it's itself national, but not in the bourgeois sense of the word. In proportion as the exploitation of one individual by another is put to an end, the exploitation of one nation by another will also be put an end to. It's a society in which there's exploitation of man by man and nation by nation. It's the historical mission of the proletariat not only to end exploitation within nations, but to end the oppression of other nations. The famous dictum of Marx, no nation which exploits another can itself be free. This is a beautiful sentence. Does it require deep intuition to comprehend that man's ideas, views and conceptions, in one word, man's consciousness, change with every change in the conditions of his material existence, in his social relations and his social life? Well, I think it does. It's not an idea which is immediately apparent until you sit down and realise how very profound it is. We Thompson said human nature. It's human nature to be exploitative, to be selfish, to go for self. Poverty is awful. So it's the nature of people to be selfish. It's the self-justification of the bourgeoisie for the system which he perpetuates. But actually, if you sit down rationally and look, say it's self-justification. It's a mode of thought which springs precisely from his material existence. And as we replace this material existence, as we get rid of the system of exploitation of man by man, we will replace this human nature. So the ruling ideas of each age have ever been the ideas of the ruling class. So our programme, the first step in the revolution of the working class, is to raise the proletariat to the position of the ruling class, to win the battle of democracy, to centralise all instruments of production in the hands of the state, i.e. the proletariat organised as the ruling class, and to increase the total of productive forces as rapidly as possible. And I've just highlighted that just to remind myself, say that the one idea which Marx revised in the Communist Manifesto in light of the experience of the Paris Commune was to point out that the proletariat couldn't simply lay hold of the ready-made state machine, but it had to break the bourgeois machine and build its own that could truly represent the interests of the proletariat. And Marx lists his programme, which is remarkable in its correspondence with the concrete historical experience. If you look at the Soviet Union, of the actual measures that were introduced. And it's well worth reading a book by Pat Sloan called Soviet Democracy to see just how well they do correspond. So abolition of property in land and application of rents of land to public purposes, heavy progressive or graduated income tax, so the levelling of wages, abolition of the right of inheritance, because the right of inheritance is a right that guarantees the bourgeois the right to pass on his capital and therefore his exploiting role in society. If wealth is commonly held by all working people, your creative conditions, your livelihood is guaranteed by the state anyway, by society anyway. Confiscation of the property of all emigrants and rebels, I like that one particularly. And centralisation of the credit in the hands of the state by means of a national bank. Centralisation of the means of communication, extension of factories and instruments of production owned by the state, cultivation according to a general common plan. Everyone has to take part in labour. Everyone, therefore, also has a right to partake of the products of labour. Combination of agriculture with manufacturing and a gradual abolition of the distinction between town and country. Free education for all. Abolition of labour for children, which is still a relevant demand if you look at so much of production in the world today. Combination of education with industrial production, etc. When in the course of development class distinctions have disappeared and all production has been concentrated in the hands of the vast association of the whole nation, the public power will lose its political character. So when there are no longer contending forces, when production is carried on in kind, when an abundance of goods is available and people are no longer in competition with each other, when man has been remade in a different mould in the absence of class society, there'll be no need of a state, which is a special body of armed men which subjects one portion of the population to another, and political power, properly so called, will cease to be. So communist society, in place of the old bourgeois society with its classes and class antagonisms, we shall have an association in which the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all. I'm not going to speak in any real detail about Marx's analysis of other forces of kinds of socialism. Feudal socialism has ceased to exist in the world and really is of historical interest only. Bourgeois socialism really does continue to exist, and I'll just touch on it very quickly because there's still ideas and trends which are current in our movement. And utopian socialism again is going to be a talk of a future presentation. But Marx points out that there's a part of the bourgeoisie which wants to redress social grievances in order to secure the continued existence of bourgeois society, to get rid of the contradictions and perpetuate capitalism and class society. And to this section belong economists, philanthropists, humanitarians, improvers of the condition of the working class, organisers of charity, members of society for the prevention of cruelty to animals, temperance fanatics, and hole and corner reformers of every imaginable kind. So general do-goodery. But he says this is not the answer. He actually says that we can call Proudhonism and his philosophy de la miserie, which is the positive philosophy, an example of this form as well. And we can substitute, we can supplement today with not only anarchism, but a kind of no-logo anti-capitalism of the Naomi Klein variety, of all kinds of green environmentalism where we want to perpetuate and sustain environmental sustainability of capitalism without doing away with the fundamental contradictions that give rise to exploitation and misery, the inequality of wealth, and the short-termism of industry, which actually create all of the problems of the environment anyway. And of course, social democracy, socialism which proclaims and professes to be socialism, but everywhere, at every opportunity, mouths the interest of the bourgeoisie and acts to perpetuate the rule of bourgeoisie. And in particular, obviously, we're talking about the Labour Party in our country and all its hangers-on.
National Socialism.
Indeed. So they desire the existing state of society minus its revolutionary and disintegrating elements. They wish ideally for a bourgeoisie without the proletariat. They all require in reality that the proletariat should remain within the bounds of existing society, but should cast away all of its hateful ideas concerning the bourgeoisie. He says we can add another type of socialism which deprecates every revolutionary movement in the eyes of the working class. It's not going to go on to talk about Trotskyism, but it could be describing it up to now, by showing that no mere political reform, but only a change in the material conditions of existence and economical relations could be of any advantage to them. It all sounds very Marxist. But by changes in the material conditions of existence, this form of socialism understands administrative reforms based on the continued existence of capitalism. So it doesn't actually mean doing away with capitalist property. Let them eat capitalism. So bourgeois socialism attains adequate expression when and only when it becomes a mere figure of speech. Free trade for the benefit of the working class. Protective duties for the benefit of the working class. Prison reform for the benefit of the working class. This is the last word and the only seriously meant word of bourgeois socialism. It's summed up in the phrase, the bourgeois is a bourgeois for the benefit of the working class.
What a sacrifice.
As we'll
But,
say in future
but it's very much the idea of trickle down, of laissez-faire capitalism, and even that you'll find behind the cuts when they're explained. The only thing you can do to get out of the situation is revive capitalism, is to resuscitate capitalism, whatever's necessary, whatever you have to sacrifice to this god of mammon. You have to make that sacrifice in order to let the situation tick over. And as long, actually, as you confine yourself to the bounds of capitalist economy, it's absolutely true. You have to do whatever's necessary to resuscitate the banks. They are too big to fail because capitalism will collapse without it. And if you can see no economy beyond the scope of capitalism, well, then you have to all put up and shut up and get on with it. And that's fundamentally the position of the Labour Party. Because fundamentally, they don't see any scope for any change beyond capitalism. So every policy they have whenever they're in government is to give more power to unfettered, power of the bankers, power of capitalists, constant privatisation, diminution of the standard of living of the workers. They're happy to chime in with all these things precisely because they go along with the idea that there's no system beyond capitalism, whatever they say. Well, they say it openly now, but what do they have previously mouthed the terms of socialisation, the means of production, distribution, exchange, the famous clause 4 which was removed. They've always in reality gone along with the interests of imperialism. And so lastly, Marx talks about socialist communist literature of the utopian socialist type, and he talks about Saint-Simon, Fourier and Owen and others who came into being and first described a communist tendency at the very early ages of the working class, when it wasn't properly constituted as a class, when it didn't understand its revolutionary role, when it hadn't presented itself as an independent player on the stage, it hasn't revealed its revolutionary potential, and therefore he praised it on the one hand for its far-sightedness, for its educational element, for being able to enlighten the workers to an extent, its criticism of the old society, but derided it for its inability to put the workers at the heart of the revolutionary movement to overthrow capitalism. And in fact, ultimately, the followers of these people rejected independent working revolutionary movements as they arose, whether that was the possibilists in France, whether that was the Chartists in England, famously Owen's followers, opposed, because they weren't going along with the ideas spun out of the heads of their great philanthropic leaders. So what is to be done? Communists fight for the attainment of the immediate aims, for the enforcement of the momentary interests of the working class, but in the movement of the present they also represent and take care of the future interests. In short, the communists everywhere support every revolutionary movement against the existing social and political order of things. And in all these movements, they bring to the front, as the leading question in each, the property question, no matter what its degree of development at the time. The communists disdain to conceal their views. They openly declare their ends can be attained only by the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions. Let the ruling classes tremble at a communistic revolution. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win.